Okay, welcome back to the course, and in this video we are going to be learning conditional rendering in React. In the previous video we covered event handling, and in videos before that we covered the rules of JSX and how to embed data into our JSX markup. So in this video we are going to learn a little bit more about JSX logic, and we're also going to learn how to render React components conditionally. So we want to be able to render a component based on a Boolean variable or a Boolean expression, and based on whether that expression returns true or false, the component will be rendered or it will not be rendered. So let's dive right in. Conditional rendering allows you to render different JSX markup for different conditions of the component, and we will very often use a Boolean expression for this, usually a Boolean variable, especially a Boolean state variable. But since we have not covered state in React yet, we are just going to use vanilla JavaScript variables in this video. But as we learn state, we will learn how we can implement this behavior in a more efficient manner. And as we learned before, JSX logic allows you to embed more advanced JavaScript logic inside of your components. So to start out, let's look at an inefficient way to do something, and that is rendering a list of items without JSX logic. In this example, we have a hypothetical to-do list app, and you can imagine that we have an array of objects called to-do items, as you can see in these embedded pieces of data in the to-do item components. We have a to-do items array, and each one is an object. So in order to do this without JSX logic, we would actually just have to embed the to-do item component directly inside of the app for however many items are in the array. And this is extremely inefficient, and in most cases it would not work because we actually wouldn't know how many to-do items are in the array unless we set a fixed size array. So for example, to make this work, we might have to limit the end user to a maximum of, say, 10 to-do items. And obviously that's not a very efficient solution or a very user-friendly one. So this is a very bad way to do things, and we will never do this. So let's go ahead and look at how we would actually implement this behavior, and that is with the map method on arrays. So here we can see we are defining a component called to-do list, and it imports a to-do item component which will contain a single to-do list item. And inside of this to-do list component we have, as I said, a to-do items array, and each one is an object. And I didn't actually put any filler data, I just put in a little note that says each to-do item will have a title property, a completed property, and an ID property. And as I said earlier, in most cases we would actually want to use a state variable for this, but we have not gone into state yet, so hang on tight and we will learn that in, I believe it's the next video actually. So let's move on and go down to the return statement. Here we are returning a div with an ID of to-do list, that's just the containing element. And then right here in bold, you can see that we are mapping over the to-do items array with to-do items.map. And the map function, if you know JavaScript already, you'll know that it takes a callback function that accepts as an argument each element of the array. So in this case, T is an object inside of the to-do items array, and then we're passing that to a callback function, and then we're returning a to-do item component for each to-do item in the array. And inside of each to-do item component, we are passing in as a prop the item. We are just embedding it right there. And so this is actually dynamic, meaning that it varies based on how many objects are actually in the to-do items array at any given moment. So if there are 5 to-do items in the array, that means that we are going to be rendering this to-do item component 5 different times. Or if there are 2 of them, or 20 of them, or 100, this will change based on how many items are in the array. And obviously this is way more efficient than our previous solution, where we just hard-coded it and put each one in individually. So that is how you can map over items in an array in React and return a component for each of them. And on a side note, you should know that you don't actually have to use a React component right here. You could render some custom JSX. You could just put in H2 here, for example, that contains the title of the to-do item. So in this case, it would be H2. And inside of there, we would embed item.title. And I've just noticed a small mistake I made. I put item here. This should actually be T. So my apologies for that. That was just a mistake I made while creating these slides. Again, my apologies. So let's go on to the next slide, and we're going to look at another pattern. This one is for conditional rendering. So conditional rendering is when you have a Boolean expression and you want to either render or not render a component based on that. Or in another case, you could render a certain component when the expression returns true, or you could render another one if it returns false, which we will look at next. So in this case, the pattern is to have a Boolean expression, then the Boolean AND operator, and then some JSX to render if that expression evaluates to true. And you may notice that this uses JavaScript short-circuiting, which means that if the expression on the left is true, then the entire expression here will automatically return what's on the right side. And if the expression evaluates to false, then nothing will happen. So here we have a home component. And inside of that home component, we have a Boolean variable called isLoggedIn, and it is set to false. And then inside of the return statement, we are returning a feed component. You can imagine that this is a social media app, and we are just returning all of the posts on the homepage. And then below that, inside of curly braces, we are embedding a Boolean expression, and we are checking if the isLoggedIn variable is true. So if the user is currently logged in right now, then we're going to return a profile component. So you can imagine that in this case, even if the user is not logged into this app, they can still see a feed on the homepage. But if they're not logged in, then they cannot also see the profile component, which might contain info about their profile, such as their name and their bio and their profile picture and everything. But if they are logged in, then the profile component renders and they can see their info. So to get some practice doing this, let's go to VS Code and implement what we just did right there. So in this empty JSX file, I'm going to just quickly create the profile and feed components. I'm not going to import them or anything or add any content in them. I'm just going to create them as an empty arrow function that's going to be const feed equals an arrow function. And then below that, we are going to do the same thing for profile. And then down here, let's make a home component and set that to another arrow function. But this time we're going to open that up and set isLoggedIn to false. And then down here, let's return a div with an ID of home. And then inside of that, let's return the feed component. And then after that, we are going to check if isLoggedIn is equal to true. And if it is, then we're going to render the profile component. And just like that, we are conditionally rendering the profile component. This is an extremely common pattern in React. It's one that you will see all the time in React code and one that you will use all the time. So that is one of the most important patterns to learn. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one. The next one uses the JavaScript ternary conditional operator, where we have a Boolean expression. And if that expression evaluates to true, then we will render some JSX. And if it evaluates to false, we will return some other JSX. And I actually put question marks at the end of these JSX placeholders. And the only reason for that is because in some cases, this will not actually be a JSX expression. It might be a number, or it might just be null. It just depends on your use case. But in this case, we are going to use JSX. So let's look at this example. It's the same home component example, where we have an isLoggedIn variable. It's set to false currently. And then we are returning a feed component, and then we are conditionally rendering the profile component. But in this case, we also have a login component. So if the user is not logged in, then we're going to render a login component so that they can log in and eventually view the profile component. So you can see here, we are using the ternary conditional operator, and we are checking if isLoggedIn is equal to true. If it is, so if the user is already logged in, then we are going to render the profile component. But if they are not logged in, then we are going to render the login component. So let's go ahead and update our code in VS Code to reflect this. So let's just quickly create a login component. So it's going to be login equals an arrow function. And then we are going to update this embedded expression to use the ternary operator. So it's going to be question mark. And if it's true, then we are going to render the profile component. And if it's not true, then we are going to render the login component. Okay, so now we are actually going to implement this in a slightly more complicated way. We're actually going to run this as a real React app, actually add content to the login, feed, and profile components. So I've just initialized a new React app with create React app, and I'm just going to go into the app.js and remove everything except for the top div containing element. And then I'm going to go to first feed.jsx, and I'm going to create the feed component. So that's going to be, again, an arrow function. I'm going to open that up and return some basic markup. So let's open up the return statement, and we are going to return first a div with an ID of feed. We're going to close that up. And then up here inside of the feed component, outside of the return statement, we're going to create an array of posts. So it's going to be const posts equals an array, and it's going to be an array of objects. Or actually, as a matter of fact, to keep this simple, let's just make it an array of strings. So let's do something like today I fell off my bike and it really sucked. Then let's do another one that says something like Angular is cool, but React is cooler. Then let's do one more, and it's going to say subscribe to the lone coder, or you will have nightmares for the rest of your life. So let me just finish typing that. Okay, so now that we have some high quality content to put in our feed, let's go ahead and put it in there. We are going to map over the posts array, so that's going to be posts.map. And then inside of there, we are going to pass in each post as just a variable called p. And for each of those, we are just going to return, let's do in h3, it's going to be a class name of post. And then inside, we're just going to pass in p. And one thing I should note here is that when you're rendering a list of components with the map method, one thing you often have to do is pass in a prop called key. This is something that React doesn't necessarily require, but you will receive a warning in the console if you don't do it. So let's go ahead and put parentheses around the p argument so that we can take multiple arguments. And the second parameter is going to be called index. That's going to be the index in the array of the particular post. So it's going to be 0, 1, or 2. And then inside of the h3, let's pass in a key prop, and that is going to have a value of the index. And that will just prevent warnings inside of the Chrome console. So now let's go inside of our home.jsx file. And first of all, we are going to import that feed component. And actually, we did not even export it. So let's go to the bottom of the feed.jsx file and do export default. Now let's go to home.jsx and we're going to import the feed just like that. And then down here, we are going to say const home equals another arrow function. And inside of here, we are going to return a div with an ID of home. And inside of that, first of all, we are just going to return that feed component. Then we need to export default home. Then we're going to go to app.js. And up here, we're going to import the home component. And inside of the app div, we are going to render that home component. So now if we go ahead and start up this app, it should just return those 3 posts as h3s. So let's clear the console. I'm going to make this bigger as always. Then we're going to run the command npm start to start the developer server. So now that this is rendered, I'm going to make this bigger, and you can see that we have our 3 posts. Today I fell off my bike and it really sucked. Angular is cool, but React is cooler. And subscribe to the Lone Coder or you will have nightmares for the rest of your life. So we have our feed rendering, including our posts array. So now let's go back to VS Code and continue this. So now for some conditional rendering. First of all, we need to go to the profile component. So it's going to be profile.jsx, and we are going to define that function. It's going to be const profile equals an arrow function as always. And inside of that, we are going to return a div with an ID of profile. We're going to open that up. Let's just return an h2. I'll just make it say my profile. It's going to be the Lone Coder. That's going to be the username. And then under that, let's put a paragraph that contains a bio. And this bio is just going to say, I am a React dev. Don't ask any more questions. And then below that, we're going to add a paragraph that just has my website name. So that is going to be https://thelonecoder.dev. And I think I'll also add in an image. So let's go ahead and go to my files. I'm just going to go to my pictures and copy this logo. Then I'm going to go into my code directory, go into our project right now, source. I'm going to create a new folder called assets. And inside of that, I'm going to paste that picture. And so now after the h2, I'm going to add an image tag. And the source is going to be a string, and it's going to be ./assets/ and what is this file called? We're probably going to rename it, so I'm just going to rename this to thelonecoder.png. And so I'm just going to pass that in, thelonecoder.png, and we're going to close that up. So now we're going to export this component as a default export as always. Then go to the home component and import it. So that's going to be import profile. And now, like we did in the example, we are going to create a Boolean variable with let. It's going to be called is logged in. It's going to be set to false. And so if the user is logged in, then we are going to render that profile component. So let's see how this is working. Let's go to our app and refresh. And as you guessed, nothing is showing up because is logged in is false. So now what we're actually going to do is change the is logged in variable from false to true. Now let's go back to the browser and see what's showing up. And now you can see that our profile component is actually rendering, but the image is actually not showing up. And I forget how React works sometimes. I think what we actually have to do is import that image. So it's going to be import logo from ./assets/thelonecoder.png. And let's see if that works if we just change the image inside of the profile component. And I accidentally imported this in the wrong file. This has to go into the profile file. So let's go up here and paste that in. And let's change this source from a string to an expression. It's going to be logo. So now if we go back to the browser, you can see that my logo is rendering. It's just very, very large. And you can see it says I am a React dev, don't ask any more questions. And my website is thelonecoder.dev. So that is working. But the last thing we want to do, just like in our examples, is create a login component. So let's find that. It's going to be login.jsx. And let's create this. It's going to be const login, and it's going to be another arrow function. And then actually, let's just export this right now so I don't forget. It's going to be export default login. And then inside of here, let's just return some JSX. It's going to be actually a form. We are not actually going to implement this form entirely. Let's just add an input, and the type is going to be, I believe there's an email type. So let's go ahead and use that. Then we're going to have another input, and the type is going to be password. Close that up. And then finally, we're going to have a button. The type is going to be submit, and it's going to contain the text sign in. So now let's go back to our home component and import that login component and change this up so that now we are using a ternary operator. So if we are already logged in, we are going to render the profile component. And if we are not, we are going to render the login component. And in order to test this, we need to turn is logged in back to false and then check if the login component is rendering. So you can see, sure enough, we have our inputs. It's a email input and a password input. I probably should have put labels in there, but it doesn't really matter for this example. So you can see we have our conditional rendering set up. So if I go ahead and go back and turn is logged in back to true, and if we go back here, then we should be seeing the profile component, and yes, we are. So that is how to do conditional rendering in React. In the next video, we are going to be learning about state in React, which is a huge part of React. We're going to be using that in almost every single project in this course, because state is how you manage your application's data. Without state, you don't really have data. I mean, of course, in this video, we had the posts array and whatnot, and we had the is logged in variable. But the problem with those is that when you update them inside of your app, like say we had a button that changed the is logged in variable to true and false, that actually wouldn't work, because as a normal variable instead of a state variable, it actually wouldn't cause the component to re-render, and so nothing would change even though the variable is changing. So state is vitally important to learning React. So we will cover that in the next video, and I will see you there.